chaos is actually good for growth people, because within that chaos lives these arbitrage opportunities, these new things that nobody else has figured out. And those sparks are what give new companies and new things life and hope.
Brian, this is such a joy to do. I mean, I feel like I've interviewed like everyone from Reforge, and so I've been waiting for this show in anticipation. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I'll do my best to live up to all the rest of the folks you've interviewed, but we'll see how this goes.
Listen, I heard nothing but wonderful things. I want to start, though, with a little bit of an entry point, which is how did you first make your first foray into the world of growth as a starting point?
I made my way into growth where I would say like 70% of like the growth OGs made into growth, which was the early Facebook platform social gaming days. If you look at like some of the top people in growth, there's like a lineage. It's like almost like a coaching lineage, like all the way back to the social gaming days. And so I had started this company shortly after school called Viximo. And we were in the social gaming space for a while, and then it kind of transitioned to mobile gaming. And that was like the perfect petri dish to essentially like create growth people, because what the Facebook platform did was that it opened up a ton of like viral channels as well as like paid acquisition channels. The games were very driven by like product driven levers, like virality. It was a highly quantitative game. You were playing this high like arbitrage game. You were constantly seeking out like the things in the APIs that people else like didn't understand. And games are so focused on like the psychological aspect of users to a degree that other software products aren't. And when you combine all of those things together, that's really kind of what growth turned into, which was understanding how your product grows, which is different than how your business and company grows. And we can talk a little bit about that later. Combining it with the quantitative elements of growth, as well as with the psychological elements of growth, right? And so those three things combined, especially in a high pressure, high competitive environment, is what really formed, I think, the like initial injection into like the growth scene. And so as a founder of that company, there was like nobody who really knew what to do and how to do it. And so a big part of a founder's job is just like go solve the problems that you don't have other people for and figure it out. And that's how I got into it. And I loved it. I actually loved the game of trying to find an opportunity that other people weren't seeing and figuring out how to exploit that. And there was just like that competitive nature of it that like really got to me, combined with like my quantitative lean on, like on the world and my skill set. And so I just loved it and I got into it and, been there ever since.
I mean, sounds like you should be a VC as well, but it is fascinating to see actually how many came from those early Facebook gaming days. So totally get you there. I do want to ask, I think so much is gained in hindsight and with years of experience. If you could go back to your first day prior to your first role in growth, and tell yourself one piece of advice, call yourself up that night before, what would you tell yourself knowing all that you know now?
Oh boy. Probably two things. One is like there's not an infinite world of growth options. It's actually it's fairly well defined and constrained. And that's something that I've learned pretty dramatically, especially through Reforge, where I get to see inside the growth of thousands of different companies, including the top public ones all the way down to your early stage ones. And it's not like there's an endless list of ways to grow. There's actually a fairly set menu of things, and you can innovate within that menu, but it's actually pretty rare that a new dish gets added onto the menu. Knowing those sets of things, I think, helps really start to hone in on what your realistic opportunities are and not. And then the second piece of that is conviction and patience. When you look at a lot of the highest flying growth strategies, right, what is underneath them is what we call our Reforge growth loops, where other people call flywheels, but they're basically systems that work like compound interest, right? They're things that feed itself and grow over time. And the really hard part about those systems is just like compound interest. It looks like tiddlywinks at the beginning, right? And it doesn't look like much. And so what that does is it puts a lot of pressure. And I see a lot of founders doing this of like, oh, this isn't working, so I got to move to this next thing. And this isn't working, this isn't moving to the next thing. When actually the right strategy is to have conviction in one of those bets and invest your way through it, because compound interest, right, it pays off later. The hockey stick happens later, right? And so you have to look for those early signals of like the fire starting and have conviction that as long as you keep adding like kindling and fuel to the fire, this little campfire is going to turn into some kind of raging thing that you can't even control like later on. And so I think I would say those two things. And I still don't think I've fully learned the patience one. Is like I think I'm still probably a little too impatient on things, but I think that's part of being a founder as well. Is I don't know, you don't have the patience for things.
I have to admit, I have these schedules, which I sent you a couple of hours ago. So I'm just going to like abdicate away from it because I think there's something I have to touch on with you. You mentioned there the compound interest and bluntly having conviction in a strategy or a channel. Yes, and I think content's a great example of that. It's about consistency and keeping going, and it's a game of who can survive the longest. Sometimes things just don't work. How do you determine when something just isn't working and won't work versus consistency? Just keep going.
This is certainly a difficult question for anybody to answer. And I wish it was like a binary thing where we could pull up a spreadsheet and say, if you're at this number, it's not working. And it's not, right. Like, I think like most things, there's a lot of science here, but there's a little bit of art as well. And I think the mistake that most people look at, and the reason they kill things too early, is that they're looking at the output and not the inputs and seeing like how those things are improving. And so I think in the content game or the podcast or whatever, maybe you're looking at traffic or downloads and all of those types of things. At least in like the content game on SEO, the things that you're actually wanting to start to look at is like, well, you know, is my domain authority increasing as I release? Is my rate of like new pages starting to increase over time? And these are like the types of signals that as they grow, they feed each other and things like start to compound. But this is also kind of gets to probably the biggest mistake I see across all of growth, which is that before anything at all, whether we want to talk about metrics or this question or all of that kind of stuff, hiring, anything, you have to have a hypothesis about how your product grows, which is captured in what we call as like a growth model. And this is very different than a business model. A business model or a financial model is saying, when I put $1 in, how do I get more than $1 out? And what a growth model says is, when I put a user in, how do I get more than one user out? And the levers between those 2 points, A and B, are actually very different than a financial model, right? So if I'm looking at a product like, I don't know, let's call Loom is one I was an early investor in and advisor in, right? Money does not help that company grow that much, right? The things that are helping that product grow are its organic, viral, and content loops, right? I record a Loom video and then I send it to somebody, right? And then that person kind of picks up the product and they start using it. Now, understanding what that system is, what that loop is, I can then start to identify, well, where are my biggest constraints in that system right now? And how might I start to unleash these constraints? So an example in Loom's case is like, hey, I could onboard somebody onto a use case where I'm recording a video and sending it to one person, like a one-on-one communication. But I could also educate the user on a use case like company communications, like I use it at Reforge, right? And that's a one-to-many use case that has a lot more virality built into it. And so I can start to influence like these steps of the system by understanding what the system is and where the constraint in the system is. The constraint also tells you who should you hire and when should you hire that person as part of the system, as well as what metrics to track along the way. But getting back to your original question, how do I know something is not working? It's not about the output. It's about understanding the system and whether or not you're able to continue improving those levers in that system and putting it on a trajectory that if I keep moving those numbers, if I keep improving those inputs, at some point, the system goes from me having to add a ton of manual energy into it to it starting to, act like compound interest and it like evolving itself. And so playing that out ends up being the fundamental key part of the equation to understand like when to kill something or not.
Brian, can I ask you, I think, I'm an early stage investor. I work with many kind of, especially kind of PLG SaaS companies, very similar to Loom in terms of kind of go-to-market and business model. And I think all the founders would say they understand the machine and the system, but they don't know what the constraint is. What do you advise founders who don't know what the constraint is?
Well, I would first go back, which is I actually think a lot of people don't understand what the machine is. And the reason is if you ask them to draw you a picture that answers how does the product grow, right? They'll either struggle to draw that picture or it'll look like such a jumbled mess that you as the recipient can't really understand it. That's actually a signal that not only have they kind of boiled it down and they understand it, but they're not able to communicate it in a way that the rest of the team understands it. And if the rest of the team doesn't understand it, that's where you run into these problems like, oh, we're going to, come up with these 10 different tactics, try them all, hope one of them works, right? Because they don't really understand how things like map to the equation. But understanding the constraint ends up coming down to the quantitative part of this, right? The exercise that I just mentioned is more of the qualitative part, is like, hey, can I draw a bunch of boxes and arrows that say, as a new user enters the system, they walk through these 4 steps. And if they complete these 4 steps, another new user comes out of it, right? That's kind of what that picture looks like. The quantitative is now taking that picture and saying, okay, this is the metric that maps to this step. This is the metric that maps to this step. This is the metric that maps to step C, right? And then saying, okay, well, where are we performing on these metrics right now? And then you need to go through the exercise of, okay, well, if I move this part of the system from A to B, what happens to the output and how does that differ between if I move, metric B from A to B? And what that starts to tell you is like, well, the system is more or less sensitive to one or the other. And then you need to layer on, well, how easy is it to move these levers as part of the system? Depending on what the loop is, there are tactics that you can use to actually pressure test this. The easiest one that you can pressure test are anything to do with paid acquisition and paid loops. Because what you can do is you can run what you call spike tests, where you basically take something that's at a low volume, and in a 24 or 48 hour period, you basically ramp up the volume as much as you can to understand where the system breaks, right? What starts to perform less, right? So if I'm spending $100 a day on a paid acquisition loop, for example, it might look like it's performing pretty well. And then I ramp it up to 200, 300, 400, 5,000, 10,000, right? And at some point, the performance breaks, and the performance will break in, your performance of your creative, in the performance of your sign up rate, something down funnel. It depends, right? And so you can really understand where is the piece that's kind of breaking the most. That's easy to do in some types of systems. It's much harder to do in other types of systems like content loop that just organically take a much longer time for plotting it out on the curve, the base of the curve, before the inflection point looks much, much longer because there's just like less levers that you can dial manually as part of that. But understanding the constraint, once again, comes down going from your qualitative system to mapping it quantitatively, starting to understand the sensitivities of all these levers, and then essentially trying to understand like what are things that you can try to understand how hard it is to essentially move these levers. And the combination of that starts to give you the indication of, okay, this is where the constraint is at in the system, and this is like where we need to focus. My last point on this is that the constraints actually tend to they follow patterns depending on the type of product. Very commonly with the product we were talking about, Loom, which is like a horizontal product, the constraint is activation. And the reason the constraint is activation is that the biggest strength of horizontal products is also its biggest weakness, is that it can be used for many, many different things, right? When a user is onboarding into the product, it's actually really hard to get them and understand what is the ideal use case to activate them on. Like, what is the thing that is like most relevant to them? But if you do activate on them, right, and it's somewhat viral like Loom, the fact that it can be used by so many people, it has such a spread rate that's kind of like the easy part of the system. It's very different than a vertical product, which is very targeted at a single persona or single market or a single use case. I actually know very specifically what I'm activating them onto. And so if I get them over that hurdle to like signing up or buying that product, it tends to be easier to activate that person, right? So it follows patterns based on the dynamics of the system and the types of products that you're at. And so these things end up being fairly predictable when you've seen enough of the game play out enough time across enough companies.
You mentioned sensitivity of levers there. I have a contrarian thought on growth hires and timing, that you don't know everyone says you should hire growth after product market fit. And I say you should hire it before, because you need to throw enough people at the machine to know if you have product market fit. You need enough data to understand if some segment of people liked it, and a growth hire can help you get that data to understand. Do you agree with me, or do you agree with everyone else that growth is a post-product market fit hire?
It's an and, not an or question. So I think this gets back to what is your type, what is the type of product, and what is the system. So it also gets to the question is, what do you mean by hiring a growth person, which is its own mess of a question in itself. And so I think I agree with you that you have to have enough volume coming into the system to really understand what these levers are in the product and what you can play with, right? And sometimes pre-product market fit, you need to hire a dedicated person that's just focused on bringing volume into the system. Sometimes you actually don't. To give you an example, like if I was to start, if I was to start an amplitude competitor, for example, a new analytics product, right? That thing is, that thing's not viral at all, right? Like you're buying that thing for tens of thousands of dollars. There's a whole like setup cost, like all that kind of stuff. There's probably a team that's really focused on building that product and building that engineering. But you need somebody in that case that growth model is going to be very marketing driven versus product driven. And as a result, you need a totally different skill set of person required to focus on, bringing volume into the system so that you can understand what you're building is on the right track or not, right? I'll use a counter example, which is like if you're working on like a new consumer social product as an example, or even something like Loom, where the machine is actually, and the loops are actually very product driven. Well, that person actually looks very close to the early product and engineering team that you're hiring. And those things are driven so much by virality that if you're not getting the viral loops working, well, then hiring a different type of growth person, a marketing or some other thing, it doesn't fucking matter, right? Like you're dead in the water anyways, right? So I think the answer to this comes down to, what do you actually mean by a growth person? Like, what type of profile does it mean? To, what is the machine that in the type of machine that you are building? And then 3, like, you can start to match, well, do I need a person dedicated to that pre or post journey, right? Loom is the example where I would probably wait till post product market fit to start to carve out like a dedicated product growth team, dedicated marketers, right? Those types of things. Whereas the Amplitude competitor is one where it's like, hey, I need somebody dedicated on this from day one to drive some volume to understand whether or not what the hell we're building is even close to on the mark.
It's a shit question, isn't it? I mean, what a bad question. What awful interviewing. I totally agree with you. It's like totally company dependent, and it sets you up for a like very challenging answer. My question to you is, you said about post PMF there for Loom. You've said before in some of your work that product market fit isn't enough. What does that mean? Because founders chase this product market fit. Like, what should it be, and how could it be changed?
Well, to add nuance to that, I would say that my quote is, product market fit is not enough to build a venture scale business, meaning like 100 million plus. I kind of pick a number out, 100 million plus in revenue within some, reasonable time period. And so I think there's like a few pieces of this. One is that I think everybody thinks about, I think one of the mistakes is people think about product market fit as a binary thing, and it actually lives on a spectrum. There's 2 vectors of product market fit. There's how strong of a fit I have and with how big of a market, right? And there's some kind of efficient frontier on that graph of like, you cross over and it's like, it's strong enough with a big enough market that that this is like a venture, we're on the venture viable path. But there are companies that certainly live with very strong product market fit, but with a small market that just aren't venture viable. And there are actually, I've seen companies that have a very large market, but weak product market fit. And those are also not venture viable, but in neither of those cases, they are viable businesses in the grand scheme of things. They're just not this little tiny world that we live in around venture. It's not part of it. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is that you have to have something called product channel fit. And so, I see this mistake less often now, but I think the mentality before was like, I get product market fit, and then I'm going to like bolt on a bunch of distribution and just like fuel it from there, right? Like that was the common thinking. And that kind of leads to all the mistakes we were talking about earlier, which is like, if I think about it as a bolt-on thing, then I think about it as like, I build the product and then I can test the dozen things and one of them's going to work and phenomenal, right? Like that'll play off. But that is not true. We cannot mold channels to products. We have to mold the product to the channel, right? And what I mean by that is Google, Facebook, Apple, whoever owns all these huge distribution platforms, they do not give an F about your product, right? Right? They are the ones determining the rules of the game, right? And so your product has to play to those rules, right? That has to mold to those, it has to mold to those rules, right? And so if you just build your product in isolation of this concept, what you end up with is like a total mismatch. And this gets back to understanding your growth system. So if your growth system is going to be very content driven, like a Pinterest or, HubSpot was very content driven with like their SEO, like all that kind of stuff. You basically have to mold your product to essentially fit with that channel. You have to be writing the content that's going to rank, or your users have to be generating the content that's going to rank, like all of those types of things. And you have to instrument your product in order to adapt to that channel. The second part of it is like, once you have product channel fit, then you need to understand channel model fit, right? Which is essentially saying that all channels don't fit your monetization model, right? So you can't use viral loops for a product that you're charging $10,000 upfront for. It just doesn't work when you do the math, right? So even if I share a product with 10 friends, it costs like $10,000, the conversion rate on my share it. First of all, I'm not going to probably share it with that many people. It's weird to share that type of product with somebody. But even if I do, the conversion rate on that is like so low that system, that loop, it like never actually really gets spinning. And so what you see is that there's channels like virality and UGC content and paid acquisition that work with lower friction, lower priced products. And there are channels like different variations of sales and other things that work with higher priced products. And so you have to match your pricing to the channel to not only match the friction, but also match the economics, right? Because if I'm using a bunch of sales, for example, right, like I have to make sure I get my money back on the cost of that human touch. So that piece has to work too.
So can I ask you, when we say about pricing channel fit there, and kind of aligning the two, would an example be like a luxury brand having a core channel in first class British Airways or Delta? I know it sounds stupid, but that was the first thing that came to mind. High price point, high luxury, like good. Like, is that what we're talking about? Because like, does that mean enterprise products should not do YouTube and Twitter? And do you know what I mean? I'm just trying to understand what that kind of means then for the high price products.
I live in a software-driven world versus, the luxury purse world. So most of my thinking is very specifically targeted at software companies, and I think for other companies, there's probably a set of different rules that rule the roost. In your example, an enterprise product, should they not do YouTube and stuff? It's more about what the purpose of like YouTube and stuff is driving for that company. Yes, it might be driving like awareness and these other pieces, but that alone is not going to drive customers for an enterprise product. And even if you were doing it, if you looked at the overall mix of like, at scale of what's driving customers, it's going to be likely a pretty small fraction. And so it kind of gets to, in an enterprise product, you have to make your sales machine work. And if you can't make your sales machine work, everything else that you're doing is just pure noise. Yeah. And so you got to get the core machine working, and then you can add these other things that help accelerate it. As an example, I think where the focus piece of it is I can do a bunch of these things, but it's actually pulling attention away in the early days from actually understanding and getting that core machine working. Riverside is actually probably a good example of this, that the product that we're on right now. I am naturally creating video, so I should probably be asking the question, well, where are all of the different places that people are consuming video? YouTube is one of them. And so then the question becomes, well, how do I make it really, really easy for my users to essentially post video to YouTube, potentially, with my branding on it? Maybe they can pay to like take the branding off of it, right? That all of a sudden starts to look like a really interesting growth system, because I bring in a user, they're going to record a bunch of videos. If I make it really easy to distribute to YouTube, and there's some exposure to my brand on it, that's probably going to bring in more customers. That starts to look a lot more interesting.
So I have to ask you two things that actually come from Kip Bodnar at HubSpot related to channel. He said on the show before that one channel working really well will get you to 50 million in ARR. Mm-hmm. Two channels working really well will get you to 100 million in ARR. First question, what do you advise founders in terms of channel selection? How to know which channel to choose?
So I agree with Kip, right? Which is that once you figure out kind of that core, that thing that's working, it's almost always in a venture scale company, the better thing to do is to focus your firepower, your limited attention, your limited capital, your limited talent on fueling that thing as fast as possible, which is very counter to like a lot of the common advice, which is like, ooh, you don't want to be too reliant on one thing. You want to diversify, like all of that kind of stuff. That is a bad investor's point of view, right? Like, yes, that might work for money management, right? It does not work for growing a business, because it ignores all of the complexity that comes with diversification of products or channels or any of these types of things. Is like, if you find something that's working, you better focus that firepower. But the second piece of that is that you then need to anticipate when that one thing might start running out of fuel. So you're not like caught with your pants down in trying to find that second thing that Kip is talking about too late, because that creates this stall out effect and is really hard to reignite. It's really hard to like get yourself going from a stall out effect.
If we just dive on that, do you think it's obvious when channels are starting to deteriorate in effectiveness and growth?
This is, I would actually say, even harder than understanding your constraint in the system. Essentially, what you're trying to do is predict a point of saturation and of what you're doing, and it's hard on multiple dimensions. One is that I think most people, I think the tendency is to actually think something is going to saturate much more quickly than it actually does. And that's because if you look at the really high growth companies, taking HubSpot as example, they, along their way on content, their path to really establishing that content loop, they hit ceilings along the way, right? And it wasn't like, they stopped at that first ceiling and been like, oh, throw the hands up, like we're done. Every step of the way, there was some new idea, some innovation that unlocked like another pool, right? And so going beyond, kind of digging beyond that is really, really hard work, because you're basically trying things that others aren't trying. And that's like actually just very hard for both people and a company to do. So I actually think predicting saturation is one of like the hardest things for companies to do. HubSpot, I would say, is actually like one of the biggest things I learned there is they are probably one of the best, if not the best at in the game at this, both from a growth and product strategy perspective. If you take into account, they have not missed 8 earnings since they went public, which was like 8 years ago. I don't know if most people, they have never missed in earnings. A perfect record as far as I know. And that was one of the biggest things I learned. I joined 18 months before the IPO, and we were already talking about a 5-year exercise of saying, like, where do we want to be 5 years and how do we work our way backwards to what we should be doing today? And where that got us was, hey, our single marketing product and our single marketing and sales motion is not going to get us to our 5-year goal, which was maintaining 50% year over year growth for 5 years. And what that led the company to do is say, oh, we need to like kick off a multi-product strategy. And actually finding the second product is probably going to take us a year or two to do. So we better start that. We better start that now. And actually, the second product might not even get us there. So we're going to need a third product. So not only do we need to plant those seeds, but we need to come up with a system to start to find new products that we can expand into. And that was the main thing that I actually that I worked on. And so a lot of it comes down to kind of looking into the future, playing out kind of your growth today and saying, okay, well, if I want to maintain some sort of growth, what does that mean a year for 2 years from now? And then you got to start going through the exercise of working your way backwards of like, okay, well, what has to be true for that to occur in our system? And what starts to feel like really unrealistic around those things? What does feel realistic? And that's just a really hard exercise, I think. That's a really hard exercise to go through, especially because you don't do it that often. And so it's like one of these like low frequency, low rep things. And there's just not that many people in the world that has a ton of reps at these things.
If we get to that critical inflection moment of predicting saturation in a channel, what do we do then? Do we go, right, we're predicting saturation and we're going to actually divert a little bit of resources and really try and carve out a content strategy, a SEO strategy, you name the channel? Or do you say, hey, we've got one channel that's saturating, let's split the resources between 4 and see which one springs with hope?
No, definitely.
Which one is the right approach?
Okay. Biggest mistakes of this are, one, not starting early enough. We already talked a little bit about that. Two, underestimating the amount of time that it takes to get a new channel or new product going. And three, over-resourcing it. And then four, essentially, this is an area where I would actually take a couple bets, but not like 10 bets. The way that we did this at HubSpot, when I came in there, my mission with a couple others was help establish a second product category for the company and a second channel, go from the sales and marketing motion we had to more of a product-led motion. We had those two missions to figure out. And the way that I did not come up with this really came from Dharmesh and Halligan, the two founders, which was the way that the philosophy behind it was, okay, we are going to start with multiple bets. We are going to treat each one of these bets like a new venture investment. We are going to seed fund this. And so they made us come and they would pitch for our seed funding for the idea, which was basically 1 year of funding for a small team, like a 4 or 5 person team. And then at the end of that year, and then Halligan JD, who was the COO, they would act like our board essentially, and we'd have to go do like board meetings internally to them every like month or a couple months. And then at the end of the year, we'd have to come pitch for our Series A. And so like the next year would be like equivalent to like a Series A funding for a slightly larger team, right? And then so on and so forth. And then at some point the bet gets big enough where it's like, okay, now we have to integrate it into the core machine. That's typically around the Series B phase, I would probably say, like internally. And then things got integrated into the machine. But as part of that, they initially funded a few bets for the first couple years, and sometimes they would work, sometimes they wouldn't, and they wouldn't pass to their Series A funding. And it was kind of, like that natural evolution. But part of that, I think, is companies, I think probably the biggest one that kills these things is they over-resource them. They over-resource these things, which, the more people you have, it's like the slower these things go, the more voices that you have in the room, the slower that you iterate and change, like all of these types of things. You want to find a couple people, like a couple generalists, kind of separate them off, protect them a little bit from the rest of the company, and essentially let them loose with the right guardrails and checkpoints with a couple people. But yeah, over resource. And look, we made this mistake at Reforge with one of our new product bets. And last year I had to kill it, fully reset it, handpick a team of 3 people, and and go forward with it. It's just, it's one of those painful mistakes that, especially with people who have something already going, they're like, oh, I've got resources, so let me just put, let me leverage that. And they fail to remember all of the lessons learned from the early stages, which is just like, sometimes more people, more money does not help you find things faster. It's about going through the natural stages with their natural constraints to find things along the way.
What do you do if it's channels working, but it's not driving back to the core? And what I mean by that is, like, I was with a company this morning, an enterprise company, and they've actually got a really impressive short form video execution, and they've done amazingly well on TikTok and YouTube Shorts, but there's no obvious correlation to customer signups or to revenue. And so it's like, yeah, a ton of people are watching your videos, but what? And I didn't really know how to advise them. Yeah. What do you advise when there's like a channel that's working in terms of attention, but not obvious value derived back to business?
It's adapt or kill. So we went through this at HubSpot. We were, the first product we built, it's now referred to as the Sales Hub. At the time, it was essentially a bottoms up tool for sales folks that let them, track their emails and contract opens and stuff. And at the time, that thing was magical. Now it's like commonplace in every single product. There was like kind of like 2 things that were working for us that were driving quite a bit of growth at the time. And we had this like incentivized referral loop. So you got to like track a certain number of emails per month. And if you hit the limit, then you can invite a couple of your colleagues and essentially get a few free months. That was working for a while, as well as we actually, because of the bottoms up, low friction nature, we were getting, paid acquisition to work. The problem that we ran into at that point was that even though it was growing, those two things actually had pretty good connection with driving growth for that product. We got to, I don't remember, it was like maybe like 100,000 weekly active users or something. And then we looked at the user base, and there was a huge mismatch between a lot of the types of users that were showing up in that product and the target market that was driving the core strategy of the business. The core strategy of the business and the marketing product was really around mid-market companies that were between 20 and 2,000 employees. And we had high conviction on that. But when we looked at the user base of this, we were like, oh shit, like these two channels, these two growth mechanisms, yeah, we're getting some of that mid-market, but there's a huge amount of these like very small business owners of 1 or 2 person shops or like other pieces that were using this tool. And there was a huge disconnect between those two things. And so we had to go through this exercise of adapting. And so what we did is like, okay, well, we've got some of these components working, some of these aren't. What if we held the market constant, like the mid-market piece? What would we do to these other pieces around our product and our channel and our pricing to make the rest of this work? And so what we did is we adapted some of the product that we were doing. We redid our roadmap around like some features for like the sales leader and the sales admin, like all those types of things that targeted more the mid-market. But then we had to change our channel. So we killed a lot of the paid acquisition. We kept a decent amount of the viral loops, but we essentially added in more of a content motion. And then we changed our pricing. That was probably like the biggest thing. So once we changed the channel, we layered in content and a little bit of inside sales. And then we had to change the pricing to match with that. So we raised prices in a couple areas, I think like minimum seat limits, all those types of things. And then the system started to work for that core market, which was the mid-market. So I think in your case, there's this whole exercise of like, oh, there's this really cool thing. And like, do we have bets that like can adapt it, can mold it to what we're trying to sell and what our product is? Let's take a couple bets at that. But otherwise, honestly, with limited time, limited resources, like you got to kill it, right? Because what you're doing is you're stealing time and attention away from finding that core machine that does contribute. You're focused on the icing, not the cake, and you need to eat the cake first. So.
Speaking of though, like knowing what works and seeing the success in a channel, obviously the decision around whether it's successful or not is largely made by the metrics that you see and how you interpret them. You said before that people often get metrics wrong.
Yeah.
I agree with you, but I'd love to hear, what do you think are the biggest ways that you see founders and growth teams really misunderstand or get metrics wrong?
Yeah, the first and foremost is metrics before strategy. I won't go too deep on that because I feel like that's like a common thing. That's the biggest thing wrong, which is your metrics are there to help answer the question, is your strategy working? Right? And so they are not there to determine your strategy. You have to have a reasonable hypothesis of what your strategy is first. Like what is your core growth loop? Like all of these things. And then you can say, well, what are the metrics that we would use to measure that strategy and what would success look like? So that's number one. Number two is they basically go quant before qual. So, to understand what your metrics should be, you have to understand the qualitative underpinnings. And a great example of this is especially around retention. Like setting retention metrics, for example, actually I would say is 80 to 90% understanding the qualitative definitions of what is the problem that you are solving, what is the natural frequency that problem occurs in your target market's life, right? And then you can start to match the metric to it. Like, should we be tracking this on a weekly active user basis or a monthly active user basis? Active, what does active mean? Well, what is the behavior in the product that indicates we are solving the problem for this user? But those things are underpinned by your qualitative definition and understanding of like your user, of the problem, of the natural frequency. Whereas I think most companies are like, well, we're just going to track it on like a weekly active or a monthly active or like a quarterly buyer case, like all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, well, okay, well, like what is the problem? Does your user actually incur that problem that often in their lives, right? And like that ends up being like the dynamic there first. I would say the third, especially among SaaS companies, is they focus on revenue metrics before usage metrics. So almost everything is defined on like ARR, MRR, my revenue retention, all of those types of things. But what people miss with that is that usage is what creates revenue. Revenue does not create usage, right? So you have to understand the usage of your product first. Like those are the things you should be focusing on, not necessarily the revenue metrics. This is a classic like sub-example of outputs before inputs as part of that. Finally is like, a lot of people mix, especially once again in the SaaS space, customers versus users, right? So there are dynamics in some SaaS products that are very different. Like HubSpot, we had a customer, but we had multiple users on that like customer's account. And to understand how to grow the business and how to grow the product, it actually wasn't about a usage metric at the customer level. It was about a usage metric at the user level, right? And this was very clear with something like the free CRM, which we built, is like we originally tracked weekly active teams, but it's like, okay, well, the way to influence a team is actually to find one of the users in that team and how we can influence their usage of the product. And oh, by the way, there's two very different types of users. There's the admin of the CRM and there's the end user of the CRM. And the way to move their usage is fundamentally different as well. Just by focusing at the dollar or the customer level, you actually don't get deep enough into the things that you need to understand to actually grow the business. You're 2 levels high. You're too high in altitude.
Speaking of actually growing the business, over the last I don't know what I would say, 6 to 12 months, AI has been the hottest thing in our ecosystem. And I'm just fascinated for you at the center of the world of growth running Reforge. Like, how do you think AI changes the way that growth teams operate and the world of growth?
This is an interesting one because I think it changes both like a lot and not a lot at the same time. And so what I mean by that is I think the surface level tactics and systems will definitely change a lot. So I would say like a lot of these analyses that, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, were sort of leading edge, things like finding what your habit and aha moment are, for example, which comes down to some form of a regression analysis, like those types of things. All those things are going to get automated, right? Like super, super simple.
Sorry, can I just interrupt you? How is finding your aha moment automated? Like, is it not highly nuanced and contextual, dependent on the millions of infinite options of what a product could be?
Right. I guess what I'm saying here is like before, your top tier growth person 7 or 8 years ago would know how to do that analysis essentially like by hand, right? Because the tooling and technology wasn't necessarily there to do it any other way, right? I think like today it's already kind of automatically done inside tools like Amplitude and others, but I think there's another layer of that where all of these things get essentially the friction to do them doesn't require the same skill set that it required you 8 years ago. But this kind of gets to the dichotomy that I was talking about. The things that don't change, right, that I don't think AI is going to really help you with that much is understanding like all of these qualitative underpinnings of your product, of your use case, of your problem, of your natural frequency, and then the psychological levers that you can tap into to move a user's behavior. I think AI is going to have a really hard time at like understanding that and doing that thinking. But in addition to that, I think I kind of put out this like a little bit of a lighthearted but serious tweet at some point, which was like, growth boils down to four things, which is you find an arbitrage opportunity, you use that to spark some type of compounding system, some type of growth loop, you optimize the crap out of that system, and then you repeat that, but don't wait too late, right? Like you try to anticipate the saturation, right? Like those things do not change, right? Like all of growth will still come down to those things. I think it's just a lot of the surface layer tactics and other components of how we do those things actually like will change. And who knows, maybe we get a fundamentally new distribution channel out of this wave of AI technology. If so, like that is like a freaking field day. It should be a field day for growth people, because when you have what a lot of people are focused on right now is like, oh, AI is going to take away traffic from Google. It's going to reduce my marketing surface areas because people are just going to be interacting with a chatbot versus, you know, a website and landing pages and all that kind of stuff. Yes, that's true. But at the same time, right, it's going to also inject all sorts of new chaos into the system. And chaos is actually good for growth people, because within that chaos lives these arbitrage opportunities, these new things that nobody else has figured out. And those sparks are what give new companies and new things life and hope.
Well, it takes us back to what we said at the beginning, really, which is, you know, the early days of Facebook and the Facebook gaming days, which is, you know, Facebook was such an arbitrage. Yeah, 100%.
Totally.
I agree with you, and I hope it does. And I agree with you in terms of chaos injecting opportunity and innovation. But you've had an amazing career. When you think about, and I think lessons are learned from often mistakes, what is the biggest growth decision you've made that went wrong, Brian? And how did it change your mindset?
So my fundamental view is like the only way to figure things out is to like create. You can do some thinking up front, right? But then you got to get into like the making, the creation of these things. And you learn through that creation of like what's right and wrong. And then you go back to like the start of the process and think a little bit. I get really frustrated with folks who think they can think their way to all the solutions. And I'm like, that's impossible. Like we just need to get into the making of things, right? I think like as a result is like, I think a lot of people look back at your question that you asked and are like, well, what is something that I thought long and hard about, but I was wrong, you know? And as a result, it like had a huge cost. I just try to view things as like, it's just always a natural like being wrong is like a natural evolution to, you know, its next step. But I will answer your question directly to satisfy you. My biggest mistake at HubSpot was a little bit of what we touched on before, which is that I was in love with like the virality and other things that we had going with the early product, but there was a disconnect with the core target market of the core business. I was pushing for like that virality and I kept going down that path and I created a lot of resistance. What I didn't see at the time was, you know, in the battle of things was that yes, even though I had those things working, the fact that there was a disconnect with the core target market meant that down the road, we would not be able to leverage all of the assets that we had already built up on the core business, all of the core knowledge around our content motion, our sales motion, our knowledge of the mid-market, like all of those types of things. And so what that did is it probably left that product in a state that a disconnect with the core business for a little too long. Luckily, I actually got vetoed over this, and we maneuvered the product and the business to a different direction. At the time, I disagreed with it, but now in hindsight, I'm like, I was the dumb one. I was stupid, and so like that was a really like bad. That was, I think, like a really bad decision. I think in the context of Reforge, I think we've probably made two mistakes. One was a few years ago, we transitioned from a transactional to a subscription model, a membership model. And that had huge growth initially, like just massive growth. And that kind of put the blinders on us to whether or not we were also doing the things to make a subscription product sustainable. And as a result, we ended up being too late to following up with some of the products and some of the features that create the type of habitual usage that's required for a recurring model. And so we had to work ourselves out of like a stall point that we talked about. That was like a case where I think the metrics ended up misleading us, and we actually weren't looking at everything that was happening underneath the surface in terms of how users were using the product, how they were thinking about the product, and how those things might end up leading to that future ceiling that we were talking about. That's a good point of like not anticipating the saturation in just like how difficult that is. I've also done some stupid growth hacks, which we can talk about, but like that's I think a different type of dumb.
Come on. We got, before we do a quick fire, tell me about a stupid growth hack. I love that.
Well, early in the Facebook platform days, one of the apps or games that we had was this virtual gifting app, and where you could like send these virtual gifts. It was like dumb, but people enjoyed it, right? And so at the time, through Facebook's platform and API, is that you could basically, when a user signed onto your app, there was essentially the ability to like auto message that person's friends, like up to 20 folks from that person. So what we did is when a new user installed the app, we would just pick, I think it was like 10 or 20 friends at random out of their friends list and send them a virtual gift from them. And this thing this was still before AWS, this thing started melting our servers like within like 4 hours. Like it was just growing and so we had to shut it off. The problem with this, besides it being incredibly spammy, was that afterwards we find out that we didn't think about this, is like when you're choosing somebody at random like that, in some cases we were choosing like ex-wives and ex-girlfriends, and they were receiving like a virtual gift of like a rose from somebody. It created this confusion. Oh yeah. And like after that, I was like, okay, that was one of the dumbest things I've ever done. It grew, it worked. We figured out that arbitrage opportunity did not translate into a sustainable system and created some really awkward conversations in the world. But that was, look, one of the fun ones for a little bit.
You send your same-sex boss a big love heart. You're like, oh,
yeah, oh yeah.
Made for an awkward one-on-one.
Oh yeah. Not good. So we'll not do that again.
Listen, Brian, I would love to move into a quick fire round. So I say a short statement and then you give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay?
Let's do it.
Okay, so what tactic has not changed over the last 5 years? If you think there's one that continues super strong.
Oh, if you word of mouth, if you can get or any form of virality, if you can get one user to tell another user, like that has been around forever, will be around forever, no doubt.
What tactic has died a death? I feel SMS people feel intrusion nowadays.
SMS feels the intrusion. However, it depends on how you define it. Like in some parts of the world, like WhatsApp, for example, is just a massive growth vector for folks. I've looked at companies that are like their entire growth strategy is on WhatsApp. So like that type of direct messaging, I think still works in like some parts of the world. I think when we talk at the tactic level of things that died, like you can basically tie it to some type of change in the distribution channel. So like, there are things that used to work on Facebook ads or within Google or like some viral loops, right? For example, that used to work. Look, just taking something as simple as like importing somebody's address book as an example. That doesn't really work anymore because there's been so much misuse of that people are skeptical and fatigue and like all that kind of stuff. Is like, you can't really do that unless you've like built up trust with your users and have a really good reason. So I think it's like all those types of things that essentially have fundamentally died. It's either due to a change in the distribution channel due to like some form of user fatigue.
I totally agree with you there. Tell me, who do you think is the single best growth practitioner that you've worked with? I know that's so hard to say given Reforge.
Oh,
but
geez.
who would you say is, come on.
Okay, I'll name a few on a different dimensions. Strategically would be Casey Winters. The best person that thinks about the psychological elements of growth would easily be Darius Contractor. The person like very specialty who I consider like a mad scientist is I call him G, but it's Guillaume Cabane. He was at Segment, Drift, like a bunch of others. But I those three on different dimensions is kind of is who I would probably name.
What do you think is the biggest misconception that people have with growth?
Growth does not mean one thing. As we've talked through, you have to understand the different types of growth systems out there, the ones that work with what types of businesses, and then how do you map talent metrics and other things to those systems. And so I think for a lot of cases, people just, they talk about growth as it's like a single thing. And that's like trying to say engineering is a single thing, but there's so many different types of engineering, right? That if you were trying to describe the discipline and practice of engineering altogether, you just like, you lose all of the substance.
Will AI change the tooling incumbents of growth teams, or will they enhance the existing incumbents?
Both.
Who's most strong and who's most vulnerable from the incumbent side?
Well, I mean, it's hard to not say Twitter right now from a vulnerability perspective. I think this is a little topic du jour, but I think you got to go Facebook for a few reasons. One is that they still have the OG growth talent that they did from 15 years ago. Javier, Alex Schultz, right? Like those people are still there, right? Like, and so you got that. You've got the capital advantage. You've got the advantage that you can leverage billions of users on your other platforms. They still have like the most data. So I think you put all of those things together. I would probably put them in the strongest point. I think they're probably like the least vulnerable as long as they focus, like the company priorities are pointed in the right direction.
I agree. Why do you think Twitter's vulnerable though? I actually don't. I think elections coming up. I think, we are early adopters. The tech ecosystem's early adopters. The majority of people don't actually know about Threads, if we're honest. I mean, we're in Europe. It's not going to be here until early next year. I think Twitter's strong. Elon's brand is bigger and bigger. I wouldn't bet against Twitter. I'd bet against Salesforce.
Yeah. So, okay. I played a fun game with a couple folks. If you would have to predict Threads DAUs and Twitter's DAUs 1 year from now, Threads is at about 100 million signups. So, and then Twitter's is, I think, like 250 million, something like that. If you had to predict, what numbers would you choose?
Oh, this is so unfair because I just interviewed Adam Mosseri, who's running Threads earlier today.
Oh, you did? Oh, yeah. That is unfair. Yeah.
And dude, I really like him. He's a fucking great guy. Honestly, I don't think Threads is going to work. I think it will honestly fail pretty quickly. I don't think they'll get retention. And I think the majority of people on Twitter are actually, 100 million of the Threads people that signed up are the 100 hardcore techies. And I think the other 900 million won't move. Like the stickiness. I think people are also forgetting two things. One is the friendship graph, and then the other is the interest graph, and they don't overlap. On Instagram, I like Audi, I like Chanel, I like visually aesthetic, inspiring. And then I have my brain, which is Balaji, is Mark Andreessen on Twitter. I don't want a correlation of them both in threads. This is not how I think the next wave of social works. So for me, super simple, to cut to your point, I would say threads does not work. Maybe it teeters along at 5 million DAU with hardcore small numbers. And I would say Twitter has modest growth to 275, 300 with election spikes.
Interesting. Yeah, I chose they're flat. I think Twitter's flat, 250 million. I actually agree. I lean in your direction, which is that I think people are overestimating, the vulnerability of Twitter. But when you ask that question, it's like I just don't think Twitter's going to grow, and that's why I think it's vulnerable, right?
Have they hit a ceiling? If you were to be head of growth at Twitter, what would you do?
Oh. I think this gets back to what we were talking about earlier, which is like you can have, product market fit lives on two vectors, both the strength and the size, the strength of the fit and the size of the market. I think what you're really seeing, and I think it was like Eugene Wei who captured this well in his essay, which is, hey, they actually had really strong PM fit with a smaller market, which like they had these like subcultures of Twitter of like tech and politics and other things. And what they've done with a bunch of their changes, like the algorithmic feed and all that kind of stuff, is they're essentially searching for PM. They're searching for that PM fit with a larger market of folks. The challenge with that is that you do that, and there's a risk of breaking like your original PM fit. And that's going to be the big question, right? Like that's going to be the big question is like, if they keep pushing aggressively in that direction. So, I think, I don't know what I would do at head of growth of Twitter. I think the challenge that they're caught in is the reason they're making all these changes is because of Elon's $44 billion buy, needing to make that money back. So he has to find PM fit with a larger market in order to make that back. And that's basically forcing essentially maybe unnatural plays into the game.
Do you know what I'd do if I was Elon?
What would you do?
I would do an Instagram clone.
Oh God, I don't know what kind of tweets back and forth that would create between Zuck and Elon.
I would do an Instagram clone, and I would make sure that there were no hacked accounts and no fake accounts. And I would say it's like Instagram with no fake accounts. Fuck you, Zuck.
Yeah, but I think your point, if Threads doesn't work out, that just goes to show like so they have the talent, they've got the distribution to leverage, they've got the data, and they've got the capital. If they are not able to create and break a network effect of Twitter, that just goes to show how strong network effects kind of can be like among a certain market. So I think that's the interesting thing that's going to play out. I kind of agree with you. I think they probably went a little too fast on the demand side of this network, and now they've got to play a game of filling that network with the right creators. And I think the question is, can they do that fast enough to like actually get that flywheel moving in a sustainable direction? So it'll be interesting.
Brian, final one. When you look at the last 12 months, not including Threads, when you look at growth strategies, what one have you been most impressed by across the landscape, and why them?
I have an unfortunately like discolored view of this, because you name a company and I guarantee somebody is a Reforge member. And so what I often see is like things on the outside that look like very smart choices, or it was either a little bit luck, or I also see what all the problems are. so
I think Canva would be one for me. Canva Talk, and
Canva has done an excellent job. Canva has done a very, very good job. And Casey Winters was an advisor to them. Goes to show like that connection, but Canva's done.
Of course, he is.
Yeah, Canva's done an excellent job. Probably. Fair, the marketplace has done a pretty dang good job here, and like the U.S. as more of an up and comer. I'm trying to just like not name, your obvious ones.
The obvious is OpenAI.
Well, so I think that's
the
one.
obvious.
I think there's a difference between a very fast growing product and the ones who had to really work for the growth tend to be the most talented teams, right? But there's these situations like OpenAI where they kind of captured lightning in a bottle. I wouldn't attribute amazing growth strategy or growth talent there. I would attribute that to amazing technology talent and product talent. But I think those two things are different. I think DoorDash is probably another one where they had to freaking work for it. And they took on some people who had advantages that they did not have, like Uber Eats and other ones. I look at that one and I'm like, ooh, like they had to work for it. Shopify probably has the best talent density at the moment. Luke Levesque is basically like probably one of the most amazing recruiters I know. And he's built a talent density there that I would easily say is probably the highest talent density team like across tech at the moment.
I totally agree. Former guest on the show, and so thrilled to hear it. Brian, I've absolutely loved doing this. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm glad I sent the schedule a couple of hours ago so you couldn't get too used to it, because that wasn't very aligned to the schedule. But this was a pleasure to do. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.